The planet Velora sat at the edge of known space like a jewel hanging in the dark. Its surface was covered in white stone cities and towers that reached so high they seemed to touch the clouds. It was a neutral world, owned by no one, and it had been chosen for one reason only. Every major species in the galaxy had agreed to meet here, inside the Great Hall known as the Unity Citadel, to sign a treaty that would bind them all together against a common enemy. The Drakari swarm was coming. They were not a species anyone could reason with. They did not send diplomats or ask for land. They simply arrived, billions of them pouring out of dark space like a tide of claws and teeth, and they consumed everything in their path. Worlds, stations, fleets, entire civilizations had already fallen silent along the outer rim. The galaxy had ignored the threat for too long, and now the swarm was close enough that even the most powerful empires could feel the ground shaking beneath their feet. Over 40 species had sent their representatives to Velora. The halls of the Unity Citadel were filled with beings of every shape and size. The Veilith Dominion, tall and pale with smooth faces and silver eyes, moved through the corridors like they owned the place. They had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 10,000 years, and they carried that weight in every step. Their senior delegate, High Arbiter Sorvon, was a figure of quiet authority. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. The Cyraxi Collective came next in importance. They were insectoid, with hard shells and clicking mandibles, and they communicated in rapid bursts of sound that their translators turned into cold, precise sentences. They controlled the largest fleet in the galaxy, and they made sure everyone knew it. Then there were the smaller species, the Pellery Federation, soft-bodied amphibians who preferred diplomacy over conflict. The Orvani Trade Union, a merchant collective that had built its power on commerce rather than warships. Dozens of others filled the lower tiers of the assembly hall, watching and waiting, and hoping that the bigger powers would protect them. And then there were the humans. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for about 80 years. In the eyes of the elder races, they were children, clever children perhaps, resourceful and stubborn in ways that sometimes surprised people. But still young, still small. Their fleet was modest. Their territory covered only a thin stretch of space along the border regions. They were respected just enough to be invited, but not enough to be taken seriously. The human delegation arrived quietly aboard the starship Resolute Dawn, a mid-sized cruiser that looked almost plain compared to the massive vessels the Veilith and Cyraxi had parked in orbit. The ship's captain, Danny Hale, was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with short brown hair and a calm face that gave very little away. He stood at the airlock as the delegation prepared to disembark, and watched the city below through the viewport with steady eyes. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Megan Ortiz, a tactical analyst who had spent 15 years studying alien military strategy. She was shorter than Danny, with dark hair pulled back tight, and a habit of speaking exactly what was on her mind, whether people wanted to hear it or not. She looked at the glittering towers of Velora and said nothing, but the slight tightness around her jaw told Danny everything he needed to know. She did not trust this place. Leading them both was Ambassador Katie Morgan. Katie was not what most aliens expected when they pictured a human diplomat. She was average height, with light brown hair that she kept at shoulder length, and a face that could shift from warm and friendly to absolutely unreadable in the space of a heartbeat. She was 46 years old. She had spent 20 years in the diplomatic service. She had negotiated border disputes, trade agreements, and ceasefire deals with species that could have crushed humanity without a second thought. She had never once lost her composure in public, and she did not plan to start now. The three of them walked into the Unity Citadel together, flanked by a small security detail. The hall was enormous. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet above them, painted with murals depicting the history of galactic cooperation. Rows of curved tables descended toward a central stage where the speakers would stand. Each species had been assigned a position based on their status. The humans were given a small table near the back, close to the exit. Katie looked at the table, looked at the grand seats near the front where the Valith and Cyraxi sat, and then sat down without a word. Danny pulled out her chair. Megan took her place beside her and opened her datapad. The first day was long. Speech after speech filled the chamber. High Arbiter Sorvan spoke about unity and sacrifice. The Cyraxi fleet commander clicked through detailed projections of the swarm's advance. Smaller species pleaded for protection. Everyone agreed that something had to be done. Everyone agreed that the treaty was necessary. Everyone smiled and nodded and said the right things. Katie listened to all of it. She took notes. She watched how the elder races looked at each other when they thought no one was paying attention. And she noticed the small glances they exchanged whenever humanity was mentioned. Those glances were not respectful. They were calculating. During a break in the proceedings, Megan pulled Katie aside into a quiet corridor. Danny joined them a moment later, his face grim. "I intercepted a partial data packet from the Cyraxi military channel," Megan said, keeping her voice low. "It was part of their fleet deployment plan, the one they haven't shared with the full assembly yet." She turned her datapad so Katie could see the screen. A map of the galaxy glowed in blue and red. The red zones marked the swarm's projected advance. The blue zones marked the proposed Allied defense lines. And right in the middle, left completely empty with no fleet coverage at all, was a wide corridor of space. Human space. Katie stared at the map for a long time. Her face did not change. Danny watched her and waited. "They are planning to use us as a wall," Megan said flatly. "They will let the swarm hit our colonies first. It slows the advance and gives them time to fortify their own borders. By the time the swarm reaches Valith or Cyraxi territory, they will be dug in deep, and we will be gone." Katie closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them again, they were hard and clear. "Not yet," she said quietly. "I want to hear them say it to my face first." She turned and walked back toward the assembly hall, her steps steady, her back straight, and her mind already working through what was going to come next. The second morning on Valora began with rain. Soft silver drops fell from a pale sky and ran down the tall windows of the Unity Citadel in thin streams. Katie Morgan stood near one of those windows for a long time before the session started, watching the water collect in small pools on the stone ledge outside. She had not slept well. The map Megan had shown her the night before had stayed in her mind like a bruise that would not fade. She had spent the late hours going over every line of the draft treaty that had been shared with the delegations. Most of it was written in the kind of careful, layered language that diplomats used when they wanted to hide something in plain sight. Phrases like strategic reallocation of defensive priority and phased territorial coverage adjustments filled the pages. To most readers, they sounded like reasonable military planning. To Katie, they were death sentences wrapped in polite words. He sat across the table in the small meeting room aboard the Resolute Dawn, reading the same documents, highlighting sections, and cross-referencing them with known fleet positions. Every time he found another clause that pointed toward the same conclusion, he set his jaw a little tighter and said nothing. Danny was not a man who wasted words. When he finally looked up at Katie around 2 in the morning, he said only, "They have been planning this for a while." Katie had nodded. She knew. Now, as the second day's session began, she sat at her small table near the back of the assembly hall and watched the Cyraxi collective take the central stage. Their fleet commander, a tall insectoid figure with dark green plating and 4 segmented arms, projected a massive holographic display of the galaxy above the chamber. Colored lines showed fleet movements. Arrows marked defensive positions. Numbers scrolled along the edges, showing projected casualty rates and supply chain logistics. Megan Ortiz sat beside Katie with her datapad open, running her own calculations in real time. She had spent years studying fleet tactics, and it took her less than 10 minutes to confirm what they already feared. Under the Cyraxi plan, 58% of human colony worlds would have no fleet protection at all during the first phase of the war. Not reduced protection, none. The nearest Allied ships would be stationed 3 full systems away, far too distant to respond to any attack in time. Megan leaned close to Katie and whispered, "They are not even trying to hide it. The math is right there. Anyone who looks at this closely enough will see it." Katie's eyes moved slowly across the chamber. She looked at the other delegations. Most of them were watching the holographic display with expressions of relief or cautious hope. They saw blue lines protecting their own worlds. They saw numbers that promised survival. They did not look at the empty spaces, because those empty spaces did not belong to them. When the Cyraxi commander finished, the chamber broke into polite applause. High Arbiter Sorvon rose from his seat near the front and offered words of praise for the thorough and balanced defense strategy. Katie raised her hand and requested a formal speaking slot. A Valith aide approached her table a few minutes later. The aide was young and nervous and spoke quickly. "Ambassador Morgan, the schedule for today's session has already been finalized. However, we can offer you a 2-minute comment window during the closing remarks this evening." Katie looked at the aide for a long moment. The aide shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. 2 minutes, Katie repeated. "I am sorry, but the senior delegations have priority." Katie thanked the aide and let her go. Danny, standing behind Katie's chair with his arms crossed, exhaled slowly through his nose. Megan did not even look up from her datapad. She just shook her head. The rest of the day passed slowly. Katie sat through more speeches, more projections, more congratulations between the elder races about how well the treaty was coming together. She kept her face calm and her hands folded on the table in front of her. She answered questions from other delegates with polite, short replies. She gave nothing away. But during the afternoon break, something unexpected happened. A small figure approached her in one of the side corridors. It was a Pelori delegate, a soft-bodied amphibian with wide, dark eyes and smooth blue-green skin. The Pelori were known across the galaxy as a peaceful species, more comfortable in libraries and laboratories than in war rooms. This particular delegate introduced himself nervously and then glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Ambassador Morgan," he said quietly, "I have seen the fleet maps. I know what they are doing to your people." Katie tilted her head slightly. "Go on." "This is not the first time. 12 years ago, the Valith proposed a similar arrangement during the border conflicts with the Nahar. They used Pelori colony worlds as a buffer. We lost 4 planets and over 2 million people before the fighting reached Valith space. By then, they were fully prepared, and the Nahar broke against their defenses. They called it a victory." The Pelori paused. His wide eyes glistened. "They never mentioned our dead." Katie was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are the first delegation I have seen that might actually do something about it." Before Katie could respond, another figure appeared at the end of the corridor. An Orvani trade representative, short and broad with rough gray skin and small, sharp eyes. He walked toward them without hesitation. "I heard what the Pelori said," the Orvani said bluntly. "He is right. The elder races have been using smaller species as shields for centuries. It is built into every treaty they write. They just hide it well enough that no one challenges them." Katie looked at both of them. "Will you speak up in the assembly?" The Pelori lowered his gaze. The Orvani crossed his thick arms and sighed. "We cannot," the Orvani admitted. "Our trade routes pass through Valith-controlled space. If we speak against them publicly, they will cut us off within a month. We would starve. Katie nodded slowly. She did not judge them. She understood fear. She had seen it in enough faces over the years to know what it looked like when someone wanted to fight, but knew the cost was too high. That evening, Katie returned to the Resolute Dawn and locked herself in the secure communications room. Danny and Megan stood guard outside the door while she opened a priority channel back to Earth. Two faces appeared on the screen. Secretary of Defense Greg Nolan, a gray-haired man with deep lines around his eyes, and Fleet Admiral Diane Pratt, a sharp-featured woman who had commanded warships for 30 years and had never once backed down from a fight she believed in. Katie laid everything out: the fleet maps, the buried clauses, the conversations with the Pelori and Orvani, the 2-minute speaking slot. Greg Nolan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he rubbed his face with both hands and leaned back in his chair. Is there any room to negotiate? Any chance they will adjust the plan? I raised it privately with High Arbiter Sorvan yesterday, Katie said. He told me it was strategic necessity. He was not apologetic. He was not even uncomfortable. To him, this is simply how things work. Diane Pratt leaned forward, her eyes sharp on the screen. What do you recommend, Katie? The question hung in the air between them. Katie felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She thought about the Pelori delegate and his glistening eyes. She thought about the 4 lost planets and the 2 million dead that no one remembered. She thought about her own people, her own colonies, her own children growing up on worlds that the galaxy had already decided to sacrifice. I recommend we leave, she said. The silence lasted a long time. Greg looked at Diane. Diane looked at Katie. Then the Admiral nodded once, firm and final. You have full authority, Diane said. Do what needs to be done. Katie closed the channel, sat alone in the quiet room for a few minutes, and then stood up and opened the door. Danny and Megan were waiting. Pack everything, Katie told them. Tomorrow morning, we walk. The third morning on Velora was bright and clear. The rain from the day before had washed the white stone city until it gleamed under the pale sun, and the towers of the Unity Citadel caught the light in ways that made them look almost alive. Banners of every species hung from the walls of the Great Assembly Hall, each one carrying the symbol of a civilization that had come to sign a treaty they believed would save them all. The mood inside the Citadel was almost festive. Delegates moved through the corridors with lighter steps. Aides carried ceremonial documents on polished trays. The Galactic Press had set up broadcasting equipment along the upper balconies of the hall, their cameras ready to send the signing ceremony live to over 100 star systems. This was supposed to be a day of history, a day of unity. Katie Morgan walked through the front entrance of the Citadel at exactly 8 in the morning. She wore the same plain dark suit she had worn every day, and she carried nothing in her hands except a single datapad. Danny Hale walked one step behind her and to her right. Megan Ortiz walked one step behind and to her left. Their small security detail followed at a respectful distance. To anyone watching, the human delegation looked the same as it had on the first 2 days. Calm, composed, and unremarkable. No one in the corridors paid them special attention. No one noticed that the humans had already moved all of their personal belongings back to the Resolute Dawn during the night, or that the ship's engines were warming up in orbit, or that Danny had quietly recalled all human personnel from the planet's surface an hour earlier. The session began with a series of short speeches celebrating the progress of the talks. High Arbiter Sorvan stood at the central podium and spoke about courage and shared sacrifice. His silver eyes moved across the chamber with practiced ease, touching each delegation just long enough to make them feel seen. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for a very long time. After the speeches, the floor was opened for final comments before the signing. This was the 2-minute window that Katie had been offered, buried at the tail end of the morning session, a slot designed to be forgotten, before it even began. Katie stood up from her small table near the back. A few heads turned. Most did not. She walked down the long aisle toward the central podium. Her footsteps were the only sound in the chamber for a brief moment before the low murmur of conversation resumed around her. She was, after all, just the human ambassador. Whatever she had to say would be polite, brief, and unimportant. Katie reached the podium and placed her datapad on the surface. She looked out at the assembly. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, some curious, most indifferent. High Arbiter Sorvan watched from his seat near the front, with a faint, patient smile. The Siraxi fleet commander sat motionless, his dark eyes reflecting the chamber lights like glass. Katie did not begin with a greeting. She did not thank anyone for the opportunity to speak. She simply pressed a button on her datapad, and a massive holographic projection appeared above the chamber, replacing the ceremonial display that had been showing the treaty's title. It was the fleet deployment map, the real one, the one that showed the sacrificial corridor running straight through human space. The murmur in the chamber died instantly. Her voice was steady and clear, not loud, not angry, just calm and precise, like a surgeon explaining what she had found. This is the fleet deployment plan that was proposed yesterday by the Siraxi Collective and endorsed by the Valith Dominion, she said. It has been presented to this assembly as a balanced and thorough defensive strategy. I would like to show you what it actually is. She highlighted the empty corridor on the map. The blue defensive lines stopped cleanly on either side of human territory, forming a gap wide enough to drive a swarm fleet through without meeting any resistance at all. Under this plan, 31 human colony worlds will receive no fleet protection during the first phase of the war. No patrol ships, no defense stations, no early warning systems. Nothing. She paused and let the numbers settle into the silence. The projected civilian population of those worlds is approximately 900 million people. A low ripple of sound moved through the chamber. Some delegates shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward to study the map more carefully. Katie continued. She pulled up the specific treaty clauses she had identified, the ones buried under layers of diplomatic language, and she read them aloud in plain words. Phased territorial coverage adjustments meant that human space would be deliberately left open. Strategic reallocation of defensive priority meant that fleets assigned to protect human worlds would be moved to protect Valith and Siraxi borders instead. Acceptable projected attrition in buffer zones meant that nearly 1 billion human beings were expected to die, and the treaty's authors considered that an acceptable price. High Arbiter Sorvan rose from his seat. Ambassador Morgan, this is highly irregular. You are misrepresenting the strategic framework of the treaty. I must ask you to conclude your remarks. Katie looked at him. She did not raise her voice. High Arbiter, I asked you privately 2 days ago about this corridor. You told me it was strategic necessity. I am simply sharing that strategic necessity with the rest of the assembly so they can see it clearly. Sorvan's silver eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Katie was already turning back to the assembly. I want to be clear about something, she said. Humanity came to Vylora in good faith. We were prepared to fight. We were prepared to sacrifice alongside every species in this room. We did not ask for special treatment. We did not demand the safest position. We asked only to be treated as equals. She looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of as many delegates as she could. Instead, we were given a seat at the back of the room and a 2-minute window to speak. Our concerns were dismissed. Our territory was marked as expendable, and a plan was drawn up, without our knowledge or consent, that would use our worlds and our people as a wall of flesh and bone to slow the swarm down while the rest of you built your fortresses behind us. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the press drones had stopped moving. Katie closed her datapad. She held it at her side and stood straight. "Humanity will not sign this treaty," she said. "We came here prepared to bleed alongside you. But we will not be led to slaughter so that others may hide behind our graves." She turned and walked away from the podium. Danny Hale and Megan Ortiz fell into step behind her without a word. The security detail closed ranks around them. The human delegation walked up the aisle toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of the great hall. No one tried to stop them. No one called out. The chamber simply watched, frozen, as the humans reached the doors and pushed them open. But something happened that no one had expected. As the human delegation passed through the rows of smaller delegations, a quiet rustling began. The Pelori delegate, the same one who had spoken to Katie in the corridor the day before, slowly stood up from his seat. He gathered his documents, tucked them under his arm, and stepped into the aisle. He followed the humans toward the door. A moment later, the Orvani trade representative stood as well. Then a delegate from the Tessari Compact. Then two more from species whose names most of the elder races had never bothered to learn. One by one, nearly a dozen smaller delegations rose from their seats and walked out of the Unity Citadel behind the humans. The galactic press captured every second of it. The cameras followed the line of delegates as they stepped out into the bright Valoran morning, their shadows stretching long across the white stone steps. Inside the chamber, High Arbiter Sorvan stood at the front, his silver eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. The Siraxi fleet commander had gone very still. The banners hung limply from the walls. The ceremonial documents sat unsigned on their polished trays. The treaty signing was over before it had begun, and the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, had no idea what was going to happen next. The fallout was immediate, and it was loud. Within hours of the human walkout, the galactic networks were flooded with footage from the Unity Citadel. Every major news service across the galaxy ran the same clip on repeat. Katie Morgan standing at the podium, a fleet deployment map glowing above her, and the long, slow walk toward the exit. It was replayed thousands of times, analyzed, debated, praised, and condemned, depending on who was watching and where they lived. The Valith Dominion was the first to respond officially. High Arbiter Sorvan appeared on a live broadcast from Valora that same evening. He stood behind a polished podium with the Valith banner hanging behind him, and he spoke in the calm, measured tone that had made him one of the most respected voices in galactic politics for decades. He called humanity's departure reckless and short-sighted. He said the fleet deployment plan was a carefully designed strategy meant to protect the greatest number of lives possible, and that the humans had misunderstood its purpose. He expressed deep disappointment that a young species had chosen to abandon the collective defense of the galaxy over what he described as a misreading of logistical documents. He did not mention the sacrificial corridor. He did not address the specific clauses Katie had read aloud. He did not explain why 31 human colony worlds had been left without protection in the plan. The Cyraxi Collective followed shortly after, with their own statement. They called humanity cowards who lacked the maturity to participate in galactic affairs. They suggested that the humans had always been unreliable, and that the galaxy would be better served by species willing to make hard choices for the greater good. Several mid-tier powers echoed these sentiments in the days that followed. Sanctions were proposed. Diplomatic channels were frozen. Trade routes that passed through Violet-controlled space were quietly adjusted to bypass human systems, cutting off several supply lines that Earth's outer colonies depended on. On the surface, it looked like the elder races had things under control. The humans had embarrassed them, yes, but the galaxy was vast, and humanity was small. The treaty could be reworked. The defense plan could be adjusted. Life would go on. But behind the closed doors of Valith war rooms and Siraxi command centers, a very different picture was forming. Military analysts on both sides had been running simulations since the moment the humans walked out. The results were not good. They were, in fact, catastrophic. The original defense plan had relied on human space as a natural choke point. The swarm's projected advance followed predictable patterns based on gravity wells and resource-rich systems, and nearly all of those patterns funneled through the corridor that human colonies occupied. With human worlds in the way, even undefended, the swarm would have been slowed by the sheer act of consuming them. It was a brutal calculation, but it had given the elder races 5 to 7 years to prepare their own defenses. Without that buffer, the swarm's advance would reach Siraxi core worlds in less than 18 months. Valith border systems would come under pressure within 2 years. The comfortable timeline the elder races had been counting on had collapsed overnight, and there was no quick way to rebuild it. The Siraxi fleet commander quietly requested an emergency session to redesign the defense grid. The session lasted 14 hours. At the end of it, the new projected casualty figures were so high that the report was immediately classified. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Earth was moving fast. The moment Katie's shuttle docked with the Resolute Dawn above Vylora, she sent a coded message to Fleet Admiral Diane Pratt. The message contained 2 words: Iron Veil. Operation Iron Veil had been sitting in a classified file on Diane Pratt's desk for over a year. It was a contingency plan, designed for exactly this kind of scenario. If humanity was ever cut off from galactic support, Iron Veil would activate a full wartime mobilization of every human shipyard, every defense platform, and every military reserve across all of human-controlled space. His orders were simple: patrol the human border, respond to any incursion, and make sure that when the swarm came, they would not find easy prey. Megan Ortiz was pulled into the central command structure at Earth's military headquarters. Her knowledge of alien fleet tactics made her invaluable. She spent her days running war games and building defensive strategies that accounted for every possible angle of attack. She slept 4 hours a night and drank more coffee than any doctor would have approved of. And she did not complain once. But Katie Morgan's work was not military. It was diplomatic, and it was perhaps the most important work of all. In the weeks following the walkout, Katie began reaching out through quiet back channels to the species that had followed the humans out of the Unity Citadel: the Pilori Federation, the Orvani Trade Union, the Tessari Compact, and others, smaller nations that had lived for centuries under the shadow of the elder races, used and discarded whenever it suited the powerful. She invited them to a meeting, not on Vylora, not in any territory controlled by the Valith or Siraxi. She chose a human station called Port Haven, a modest trading post orbiting a quiet yellow star far from the political centers of the galaxy. 12 species sent representatives. They arrived in small ships, without fanfare, without press coverage, without ceremony. They gathered in a plain conference room with metal walls and recycled air, and they sat around a simple table. Katie did not give a grand speech. She simply laid out a proposal, a mutual defense compact between equal partners, no hidden clauses, no sacrificial corridors, no species treated as expendable. Every member would contribute what they could, whether it was warships, sensors, supplies, medical support, or intelligence, and every member would be protected equally. She called it the Free Worlds Accord. The Pilori delegate, the same one who had spoken to Katie in the corridor on Vylora, was the first to agree. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his words were firm. "My people have waited a very long time for someone to offer us this," he said. "We accept." The Orvani followed, then the Tessari. One by one, each species at the table added their name to the accord. It was not a powerful alliance by galactic standards. The combined fleet of the Free Worlds Accord was a fraction of what the Valith or Siraxi commanded. Their territory was scattered, and their resources were limited. But they had something that the elder races did not. Real trust, built not on power or fear, but on a shared understanding that none of them would be left behind. Word of the Free Worlds Accord spread quickly. The galactic networks picked up the story within days. Some commentators mocked it as a collection of minor species playing at diplomacy. Others watched more carefully and saw something that made them uneasy. High Arbiter Sorvan saw it too. He sent a private message to Katie Morgan, offering what he called revised terms for humanity's inclusion in the original treaty. Katie read the message carefully. The sacrificial corridor had been reduced in size, but it was still there. The language was softer, but the intent was the same. Fewer human worlds would be left undefended, but some still would be. Katie sat at her desk on Port Haven, stared at the message for a long time, and then typed a single-line reply. "You are welcome to try again when you mean it." Then she went to find Danny and Megan, because there was still a war coming, and they had a great deal of work to do. The Drekari swarm came 6 months later, and they came faster than anyone had predicted. The first reports arrived in the middle of the night cycle on a dozen worlds at once. Deep space sensor arrays along the outer rim lit up with contacts, thousands of them, then tens of thousands, pouring through the dark spaces between stars like a river of black and red. The swarm did not send warnings. They did not announce themselves. They simply appeared, and everything they touched began to die. The Siraxi Collective's outer defense line was the first to feel the impact. 3 border stations were overrun within hours. The insectoid species had built their defenses expecting to have years of warning and a human buffer zone to absorb the first blow. They had neither. The swarm hit their forward fleets at full strength, and the result was devastating. Siraxi warships were powerful, but the Drekari did not fight the way conventional enemies fought. They did not form battle lines or target critical systems. They swarmed, literally, pouring millions of small, fast-moving organisms against hulls and shields until the sheer mass of them overwhelmed every defense. Ships that could withstand a direct hit from a plasma cannon were torn apart by a billion claws working in mindless unison. Within the first week, 4 Siraxi colony worlds fell silent. Their populations, numbering in the hundreds of millions, were consumed. The Siraxi fleet commander ordered a full retreat to the second defense line, abandoning the outer territories entirely. The Valith Dominion fared slightly better, but only because the swarm had not reached their borders yet. High Arbiter Sorvan watched the situation reports from his command center on the Valith homeworld with growing horror. The timeline he had been promised, 5 to 7 years of comfortable preparation, had been a fantasy. The swarm was moving through the gap in the defense grid like water through a broken dam, and it was heading straight for the heart of the galaxy. Sorvan did something he had never done in his long career. He sent a public message to humanity, broadcast across every galactic network, asking for help. There were no conditions attached, no hidden clauses, no diplomatic games, just a simple, open plea from a proud species that had run out of options. The message was short. The Drekari are at our gates. We were wrong. We need you. The galaxy watched and waited. On Earth, the message arrived during a session of the United Earth Council, the governing body that oversaw humanity's place in the galaxy. The chamber fell silent as the broadcast played on the main screen. Sorvan's face, usually so composed and confident, looked pale and strained. His silver eyes had lost their sharpness. He looked, for the first time, like someone who understood what it meant to be afraid. The council erupted into debate. Some members argued that humanity owed the elder races nothing. They had been betrayed, dismissed, and nearly sacrificed. Why should human soldiers die for species that had tried to use them as a shield? Others argued that the swarm was everyone's enemy, and that letting the elder races fall would only delay humanity's own destruction. Katie Morgan was asked to address the council. She stood at the podium in the same plain suit she always wore, and she spoke simply. "I understand the anger in this room," she said. "I share it. What was done to us at Valora was wrong. It was calculated, it was deliberate, and it would have cost us everything. We have every right to turn our backs." She paused and looked around the chamber. "But that is not who we are. We did not build the Free Worlds Accord out of revenge. We built it because we believed that every species deserves to be treated with dignity. If we refuse to help now, we become exactly what they accused us of being. And if we help, we prove what we have always known about ourselves, that we are better than the way we were treated." The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The United Earth Council authorized military deployment in support of the galactic defense. The Free Worlds Accord mobilized within 48 hours. It was not just a human response. It was the response of every species that had walked out of the Unity Citadel on that bright morning 6 months earlier. The Pelori Federation contributed their advanced sensor networks, the most sensitive detection systems in the galaxy, capable of tracking swarm movements across entire sectors in real time. The Orvani Trade Union opened their vast supply chains, flooding the front lines with fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The Tessari Compact sent their engineering corps, specialists in rapid construction, who could build defensive installations on a planet's surface faster than anyone thought possible. And humanity sent its fleet. Danny Hale stood on the bridge of the Resolute Dawn as his battle group dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly into the combat zone. Through the forward viewport, he could see the swarm. It was not like anything he had imagined. It was a living wall of bodies stretching across the blackness of space, millions of organisms moving in terrible unison, blotting out the stars behind them. Ahead of the swarm, a Saraxi colony world hung in space, its orbital defenses shattered, its surface already darkening under the shadow of the approaching horde. The Saraxi had written it off. They had pulled their remaining ships back and left the planet to die. Danny opened a channel to his battle group. "All ships, this is Hale. We are not leaving those people down there. Formation Arrowhead, weapons free on my mark." The human warships surged forward. What followed was the most intense naval engagement in human history. Danny's battle group drove straight into the leading edge of the swarm, their weapons carving bright lines of fire through the mass of living bodies. The Drakari reacted with mindless fury, redirecting millions of organisms toward the human ships. Hulls groaned under the pressure. Shields flickered and strained. But Danny had trained for this. His crews had trained for this. Every scenario Megan Ortiz had run in her war games had included this exact kind of overwhelming assault. And the tactics she had developed held firm. The human ships fought in tight, coordinated groups, covering each other's blind spots, rotating damaged vessels to the rear, and maintaining a relentless rate of fire that chewed through swarm formations faster than they could regroup. Megan herself was aboard a command carrier positioned behind the main battle line, coordinating the combined fleet operations of the entire Free Worlds Accord. She had a dozen species reporting to her, each with different capabilities, different communication protocols, and different instincts in combat. She wove them together like threads in a fabric, assigning each force to the role it was best suited for. Pelori sensor ships fed real-time swarm movement data directly to the firing solutions of human cruisers. Orvani supply frigates kept ammunition flowing to the front lines without interruption. Tessari engineers deployed mobile defense platforms in the space around the colony world, creating a layered shield that the swarm could not easily penetrate. For the first time in the recorded history of the galaxy, a Drakari offensive was stopped. The swarm's advance broke against the combined defense, like a wave against a seawall. The living tide faltered, fragmented, and began to pull back. The organisms, driven by a hive-mind intelligence that had never encountered real resistance before, did not know how to adapt. They retreated into deep space, leaving behind a field of dead, so vast it looked like a second asteroid belt. The Siraxi colony world survived. Its people, who had been preparing for death, looked up at the sky and saw human warships holding the line above them. In the weeks that followed, the combined forces of the Free Worlds Accord pushed the swarm back across 3 more systems. The Drekhari were not defeated. They were too vast for that. But they were contained. The advance was halted. The bleeding stopped. And then came the treaty. Not on Velora this time. The new treaty was drafted aboard Port Haven, the same modest station where Katie had first formed the Free Worlds Accord. The conference room was the same plain metal box with recycled air and simple furniture. But this time, every major species in the galaxy sent representatives, including the Valith Dominion and the Siraxi Collective. Katie Morgan sat at the head of the table, not because she demanded it, but because every other delegation insisted on it. The new treaty was simple. It was written in plain language. Every clause was transparent. Every commitment was mutual. No species was designated as expendable. No territory was marked as a sacrifice. Every member of the alliance would contribute according to their ability, and every member would be protected equally. High Arbiter Sorvan signed the treaty without a single objection. His hand was steady, but his face was not. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. The silver in his eyes seemed duller. As the delegations filed out of the conference room, Sorvan paused in the corridor next to Katie. He stood there for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he said quietly, "We underestimated you." Katie looked at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only the tired calm of someone who had carried a heavy weight for a long time, and was not yet ready to set it down. "No," she said. "You underestimated what happens when you treat good people like they are disposable." Sorvan held her gaze for a moment, then lowered his head slightly and walked away. Then she turned and walked in the other direction, toward the docking bay where the Resolute Dawn was waiting. Danny was there, leaning against the hull, with his arms crossed, looking like he had not slept in a week, but was somehow still standing. Megan was beside him, her datapad tucked under her arm, already working on the next set of defense projections. "It is done," Katie told them. Danny nodded. Megan allowed herself a small, rare smile. The galaxy would remember this moment for a very long time, not because humanity was the strongest species, or the most advanced, or the most feared, but because when they were pushed aside and treated as worthless, they did not beg, they did not break. They walked away with dignity, built something better with the forgotten and the overlooked, and then came back to save the very people who had tried to sacrifice them. But because it was the right thing to do. And that, more than any fleet or weapon or treaty, was what made humanity terrifying to every species that had ever underestimated them.